today we are talking to Dr. Deb Gorton. She is the Gary Chapman Chair of Marriage, Family Ministry, and Therapy at Moody Theological Seminary and Grad School, but more so, the author of her newest book, Embracing Uncomfortable, Facing Our Fears While Pursuing Our Purpose. So, Dr. Deb Gorton, welcome.
Thank you.
And of course, one of my favorite people in the world, Jillian Anderson, is co-hosting with me today. So, Jillian, thanks for taking some time to talk.
Oh, I always love to get to join. You know, I was just telling Tommy before this, I feel like this is just an excuse for friends to catch up. Deb and I have been involved in similar things in Chicago through the last, a number of years. And so it's fun to get to hear a little bit more about what's been on your heart, what you've been writing about, the work that you're doing. We're excited to get into the conversation today.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, and I think for the three of us, we've known each other for a number of years now. So it makes it easy for us to engage each other like a conversation with friends.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, Deb, let me start off with this. Is your book, you and I have been talking about you writing a book for some time now. What was the impetus for writing this book? What was the hope that you got from, because you're, and as we're going to talk about, very, very personal in this book. What was the impetus in writing this book?
Yeah, I do give a lot of personal stories in the book, which is quite uncomfortable. Haha. But for me, it was really this idea of recognizing the false identities in my own life, you know, whether you want to call it imposter syndrome or embracing kind of the lies that we believe about ourselves. I had this experience, which was really triggered when my mom unfortunately took her own life a number of years ago, to self-explore and to start realizing, like, what are the things I believe about myself that are not true? And how do I start kind of shedding those lies from my life and how they're impacting my relationships? And when I started doing that, it was kind of obvious to me that a lot of my clients were navigating similar experiences, that they had these false sense of identity or purpose in their life, but really pursuing what was true to their core being was hard. It was uncomfortable. It meant going against the grain in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and Deb, I think that's a good point. Last night, as I was reading through your book, I know I actually sent you a text, and I'm like, you're in my head, you're speaking to me right now. But you do share a lot of personal stories, and you talk a lot about just the power of knowing our own purpose. And I wanted to actually pull out one of the quotes that stuck with me, because you reference this idea that our purpose doesn't come through what we do; it rather emanates through who we are. So you write, who we are breeds purpose, but what we produce bears witness to that purpose. And I think something that resonated with me is sometimes this incongruence that we feel, where it's you want to live a certain purpose, but yet the decisions you're making on a daily basis aren't always meshing with that. Why, from your perspective, is knowing our purpose so important?
Yeah, for me, and I think what is oftentimes missing in others' lives is it's like the compass north. It is what gives you a sense of direction in all of your decision making. And, you know, I think we focus on the big picture of purpose in our lives and oftentimes intertwine it with vocation and accomplishment. And yet it's those everyday small decisions that I think are really most impacted by both knowing what our purpose is, but also having either a lack of understanding around what our true purpose is, or maybe a misguided understanding of what our purpose is.
Hey, now, Deb, let me ask you a quick question. I mean, you and I have talked with so many different younger leaders in our lives, and we always hear the same thing. I want to know what my purpose, I want to know what my calling is. And sometimes we sit there and we assume that they know, but we realize that they may just need some guidance. How do you practically encourage someone or help someone figure out what that purpose is? Does it just come over time through life decisions, or how do you tangibly figure out what that purpose is?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll give the caveat. I think it's much easier for me when I'm working with leaders that have a faith-based background, because I think our purpose is intimately intertwined with who God created us to be. But I do think it takes community, people that know you, that know the intimate parts of who you are and what you're passionate about, and then having those conversations and taking time to reflect on what you're drawn to. And that's in relationship, that's in vocation, that's in the way you interact with people, whether it's in a church community or other kind of corporate settings in your life, collective corporate experiences. But I think, again, the key is, so I would distinguish between purpose and calling. I think calling is more related to vocation, and purpose is more related to like how you interact with the world. And again, that's not just limited to what you're doing on a daily basis from 9 to 5. And in the book, I give this example of a bus driver that I encountered in the city of Chicago who completely blew my mind. And to this day is probably one of the foremost examples of living out purpose. And, I got on her bus and she was unbelievable. Like, welcome aboard my bus. It's an amazing day. Get to know the people next to you. And for those of our listeners that are in Chicago and take public transportation, that is not a common experience among Chicago bus drivers.
It is not.
No. And she did this the entire ride. And I kind of I finally worked my way up to the front and I was like, I've got to talk to you. What is different about your life? And she's like, this is my purpose. And I just got this great sense in talking to her that she was the exact same person, whether she was in line at the grocery store, buying coffee from a barista, or talking with a family member that had starkly different political views. Like just this natural sense of inviting people in, making them feel welcome, making them feel loved, and making them feel like they had a sense of purpose in the world. And it didn't matter what her role was from, an occupational perspective. She was living that out in every part of her life.
Hey, Jillian, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yeah, go for it.
Hey, Deb, if I ask you, what is your purpose in your life?
So I would say that my purpose, no surprise, is embracing uncomfortable and teaching others to do so for the greater calling of community. So I believe that this practice and, talk about relevance to our current context in this world, especially talking about like the racial unrest and injustice in our country, in order to bring healing into our community, we have to be willing to embrace uncomfortable. And I especially believe that's true of people like myself in the white majority culture, where we've resisted these conversations. We've resisted acknowledging our own racial tendencies. We don't want to sacrifice to see the change that's necessary. But in order to create true biblical justice and true biblical community, it requires this willingness to embrace uncomfortable choices and conversations, you name it.
Yeah. And Deb, maybe just taking what you're talking about there and even the story of the bus driver, I love this idea that you talk about your purpose and calling are different, right? Your purpose is kind of gives you that North Star, that direction in your life. And I think about even that story of the bus driver and there are probably days where she didn't feel like living out that purpose as she drove her bus. And even bringing in the national conversation, there are days, we know this from our Gallup data, there's a lot of emotions that people are feeling right now, whether that is stress, anger, worry, frustration, right? How do you balance, and you talk about this some in the book, but you talk about this almost kind of Venn diagram concept of balancing and validating emotion, but then also bringing in fact and purpose and thinking about the alignment of those two together. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And in particular, in this context that we're living in, how do we think about navigating those two things together?
Yeah. So the main purpose of the Venn diagram, which stems from a form of counseling that I practice called DBT. But the idea is, you think about the circles in geometry, this good old fashioned geometry lesson, in a Venn diagram, and it's boundaries. And so this idea of looking at our emotion, but within the boundaries of its experience, and looking at our facts, but within the boundaries of truth. And oftentimes I see that people forsake one for the other. So either this is entirely true, therefore I should feel content or happy or at peace about it, or I feel this way, therefore it can't be true. And so this balance of saying, all right, I feel disappointed, discouraged, tired, overwhelmed, and I can still continue to pursue purpose, right? And what do my emotions tell me? Maybe I do need to rest or take a break or say no to something. But that doesn't mean I'm a failure or I'm a disappointment to other people or fill in the blank, right? So it's this kind of dance between the two. I can give a real personal example actually to kind of maybe make the point a little bit more relevant.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So this book came out 3 weeks ago today. Talk about an interesting climate to launch a book called Embracing Uncomfortable. It takes a while to write a book, so it's not like I was planning on the timing of this book coming out. And so last fall, I met with my publicity team, and we talked about how to market the book. And it involved doing, book launch and talks and all kinds of in-person things. And then COVID hit. And so we got together, we kind of reoriented our marketing plan and strategy. And it was all about social media and getting the people that endorsed the book and other influencers to post about the book and talk about the experience. And then the tragic murder of George Floyd happened, and the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at the people that have endorsed my book, many of whom are people of color, people in the Black community. And I realized, like, now is not the time to say, hey, let's focus on Deb Gorton's book. I need to be silent, and I need to highlight other voices and their experiences right now. And I was like, I wonder how my publisher is going to feel about this. Like, essentially, I'm saying, hey, I'm not going to market the book right now. It's not the time. And if I were being 100% honest, I was disappointed. And yet I can look at that feeling, and I can truthfully acknowledge my disappointment in comparison to decades upon decades of injustice to our minority communities, and especially the Black community, pales in comparison. But if I deny the disappointment, well, it's still there. And so I've got to place it in the context of, this is my feeling and my experience. I'm going to acknowledge it for what it is. But my true value, my true purpose, this idea of embracing uncomfortable for the benefit of community necessitates that I put my own needs on the back burner for as long as needs to happen in order to highlight the voices that really need to be heard right now in order for systemic change to occur. So the context of the emotion, it's a valid experience, it's a real experience, and I need to acknowledge it, but also I need to state what the facts are in order to move forward in a way that's congruent to what's most important to me.
And then you tie it in with this whole idea of pausing. And Deb, the reason why this is so important for me, and we share a mutual friend, Julius Wong-Loy Singh, and he said to me when I was in seminary, and he says, Tommy, you're always focused on going. If you don't stop and pause and reflect, you are doing a disservice in your life. Talk a little bit about this whole idea of pausing.
Yeah. So it stems from this practice that I have called recognizing that every decision we make involves a loss. And Tommy, what you just said is such a classic example. And I struggle with this in my own life, this going. Within our Western cultural context, individualistic society, we're very achievement oriented. And so we tend to focus only on gains and accomplishments and yeses in our world. And oftentimes it's because it's directly tied to our sense of significance and worth. So if I say no to something, I'm losing out, I'm disappointing, I'm, fill in the blank, I'm failing. And so if we say, okay, every decision involves a loss, that's not meant to be pessimistic or glass half empty. It's just reality. Then we kind of shift our perspective to focusing not only on the gains, but the losses that we're choosing to incur by saying yes to something. And so when it comes specifically to pausing and to resting, I know in my own life, talk about the Enneagram, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, I'm an achiever, like we're the classic say yes to everything person. But when I say yes to things, the loss is oftentimes my own, time to myself, time in the Word, time exercising, taking care of myself, grocery shopping, and spending time with friends, all of those things that are incredibly important to my holistic health and well-being. And so when I see the necessity of reflection, I also couple it with, okay, every decision involves a loss. What is the loss I do not want to incur? If I truly do not want to lose out on my own health and well-being, which is necessary to be able to continue the work that I'm doing, I've got to say no to things, and I've got to choose to lose on the other side, whether it's, being able to do some type of project that I'm really excited in, taking on a new leadership opportunity, working with clients. I mean, telling a client no can be very, very difficult. But it's just got to be a part of my regular practice.
Yeah, and Deb, I think that resonates with me as a fellow achiever. Lisa TurKhurst has a book that's My Best Yes, and it was really, really helpful for just thinking through this. And I think about even a lot of the leaders that I get to work with that, especially right now, I think burnout is more of a problem than ever before because you've got home and work kind of melding together in a new way. And, I know for you, you're still getting to counsel people through this season. You get to lead a number of other clinical psychologists. As you think about just what you're hearing in those those conversations, what are some of the challenges people are facing right now that even for those listening in, they may go, oh my goodness, yes, that's me. And then I'd love to kind of talk about, how you even get unstuck in this season too.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because it all kind of comes back full circle. I joke about the book, like every step is a layer of the onion, embracing uncomfortable. Like, okay, this first step is going to be uncomfortable. And then you're going to get to the next step and it's going to be more uncomfortable. But I think we have this idea, this false expectation that once I know what's most important to me, it's going to feel comfortable pursuing that. And so when it doesn't, we kind of knee-jerk reaction shift back to the way we were functioning before. It's kind of like, I don't know if you all like to work out. I don't. I've never been one of those people that wakes up and is super excited to go to the gym or go for a run or do any type of physical activity outside of like walking and riding my bike and whatnot. And yet I recognize the value of it. But I think in my mindset for a really long time, I kept thinking, well, once I really get excited about going to the gym, that's when I'll start going. And instead I had to shift and say, no, I'm never going to like it. Or maybe someday I will, but I know I don't right now. And yet I still need to go. And so I think that same idea of, okay, I know I need to say no to things. So now that I know, it's going to feel, I'll be content when I say no, or I'll feel a sense of peace and calm. And typically that's not the case. Like we feel anxious, we feel nervous, we feel ashamed, we feel guilty, we feel disappointed, all of these fears that kind of come flooding in that can unfortunately cause us to shift right back to, okay, I better say yes, or I better commit to this. So recognizing, maybe what we consider the disparity in what we're doing versus what we're feeling, and knowing it's okay. And that's where that validation piece is really critical. Second for me is accountability. I cannot do this in isolation, and a diverse community is really critical to that. Like I have learned so much more about community from my friends that are in more collectivistic cultures, and the health and well-being that thrives in those communities that I've really learned to come and value and try to pursue in my own life. That's incredibly important to me.
Yeah, I think that's well stated. Deb, I just want to ask you to speak directly to somebody who's listening in right now and in this season is going, I love everything you're talking about, but I feel stuck. What's the first step for somebody who's listening in and that's where they're at right now? What do you advise them?
Yeah. Maybe one of two things. So one is perhaps you need to rest before you start moving forward. Maybe that's why you're feeling stuck, is you're already incredibly overwhelmed. And so consider, again, going back to that question of if all decisions involve loss, what is the ultimate loss I don't want to incur right now? And so therefore, what am I willing to get uncomfortable doing? Like maybe it's saying no to a commitment at work, or going out with friends on a Saturday night, or something that you might even look forward to, but is sapping up your time to really spend alone and reflect. That's one. The second is oftentimes we get overwhelmed by the big picture goal. We don't think about the smaller day-to-day goals. And so step back and look at what's one thing just today that you might be able to pursue in this, sense of finding your purpose and choosing consistent with your values. And maybe that will kind of get you out of that place of feeling stuck. Yeah.
Hey, Deb, remember when I was working on this sermon last week and I emailed you on the story of Elijah and the situation at Mount Carmel? There's this huge demonstration of God's power. And then from that point on, he is stuck. He's frustrated. He's depressed because someone's coming after him to kill him. So he runs after him and God leads him to a cave. I mean, is that sometimes you're stuck and God just needs to really come alongside and reveal himself to you? I mean, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that can absolutely be part of it. And, I think sometimes too, we get this sense of like waiting on God, waiting for, our calling to be fulfilled in our life is this terrible sense of lack of accomplishment or lack of impact. And yet, when we see the Jewish translation of the word waiting, it's a very active experience biblically. And so it means like God is still calling us to, again, live out our purpose in our daily lives, regardless of if he's still moving us to a bigger calling or however you want to frame that. I think about, okay, so by the worldly standards, you could certainly say I've had some occupational accomplishments. Like I have a doctorate, I'm running a master's in counseling program. And yet when I look back on the experiences in my life, I would say the greatest impact I had on individuals in a day-to-day capacity when I was working as a barista at a local coffee shop in college. And honestly, there are days where I'm like, I want to go back to doing that. I loved doing that. And I just had these relationships with my customers and knew about the details of their lives. And so I think we just get the sense of like, I'm stuck, like God's just got me waiting. I don't know. Maybe you could think a little bit more creatively and see where you're actually, where your spheres of influence are right now in this moment, while still potentially mourning or grieving the loss of where you wished you were at this point in your life that you're not at.
Jillian, I love that story in First Kings, because instead he sends the angel of the Lord and he does not say anything, but what he does is he tells him to rest, to eat, to drink, and to sleep, and then leads him on a 40-day spiritual retreat. From that point in time, after that, God then comes and talks to him and says two times, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Deb, I asked you this. What does that mean? Why do you think God kept asking him, "Elijah, what are you doing here?" What was he trying to accomplish?
You know, I think, again, it kind of goes back to this challenge of self-reflection. Like, the reality is God gifted us the ability to choose. We chose knowledge, and I think he's going to hold us accountable to that, and to that decision, which means that we have to be disciplined in reflecting daily in order to really discern whether or not our thoughts and our actions and our behavior is surrendering to God daily. And I know in my own life, when I look at the church, oftentimes, unfortunately, that's not what we're actually seeing. I think our behavior more often mirrors the greater culture than the Christian culture.
Yeah. Hey, validation. Yeah, I was as I was reading your book, you talk about this whole thing about the importance of validation, and you says, "Hey, I could write a whole book on that, and maybe that could be your next book." But you say we confuse validation for agreement. Can you explain a little bit more what that means?
Yes, I can. And I see this so often in couples counseling. Oh my goodness. So I think we have this sense of like, okay, and in order to have my position validated, you have to agree with me. We've kind of lost this ability to be in relationship with others that we disagree with. And I think we see this in huge ways in our country right now. And so the result of that is we go into conversations with the mentality of, I'm going to listen to you in order to respond in a way that furthers my position to get you to agree with me. And if you don't agree with me, then you completely invalidate my entire existence. And yet, if we go in with a perspective of listening to understand, to really hear where the other person is coming from, it doesn't matter really if you agree with them or not, to validate their experiences and what they've gone through. And I actually think when we try to either put ourselves in the shoes of another person and come up with some way that we could understand what they're going through, we inadvertently invalidate their experience. Because then you're saying, "Oh, I totally understand what you're going through," when you haven't. And the other person is like, "How could you possibly know what I've gone through in my life?" But think about it. Try it the next time you're in conflict with somebody, to just listen, to really understand where they're coming from, and to simply say, "Wow, that had to be a really painful and frustrating experience. I can only imagine how hard it would be to have to go through that each day or today," or whatever it was. You're not agreeing with them. You're simply saying your experience is valid. It's real. You encountered this. And by doing that, you're acknowledging their humanity and saying you're worthy of a different experience. Again, whether I agree with it or not doesn't really matter. I'm just saying, hey, I see you, I hear you, and I'm embracing you where you're at right now in this moment.
And Deb, I can't help but think about the fact, I'm sure that's powerful in couples therapy, I feel like that's powerful in our current national narrative right at the moment as well. The power of listening and validating emotions from so many different sides, so many different perspectives. I want to come back to this concept you brought up a couple times, the idea of community, and even just tying this in with a lot of what our nation is thinking about right now. You know, you recognize the role that community plays in helping each of us grow. And I want to actually read one sentence that stood out from the book. You said, consider your own community. If your community resembles you on every demographic measure, the likelihood that you are living in false or misleading comfort is high. So given the national conversation that we're having right now, if somebody is listening in and they listen to that and they kind of look around and I think your litmus test is like the dinner table or who you're hanging out with as your friends, and they're realizing, wow, I'm kind of choosing comfort right now in this season. How does somebody embrace the uncomfortable with their own community right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first step is being the one to bring it up, to say to your community, hey, I think we may be a bit homogenous here. And what are we going to do to really shift and change that? You know, unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of examples of that. One of the things that makes me a little uncomfortable in the healthy side of discomfort is that I've seen a lot of predominantly white churches having conversations with a local Black pastor right now and talking about, and I think it's good that we're having this conversation. So don't mishear me there. I think it is important. But when their church leadership is predominantly one culture and predominantly the majority white culture, and yet they're saying they value diversity, they value they value diverse voices in their congregation. What are you actually doing to then now take the steps to diversify your leadership? And the other thing I see with churches is the claim that we're a multicultural church. And you may have a diverse leadership. That may very well be true, but instead of it being multicultural, it's more multiracial. Meaning we've got Black and brown people on our staff, but our preaching style, our worship style, the way that we understand Scripture is still interpreted through the majority culture lens. And so I think it's really, first of all, taking the step to look inside yourself and say, okay, what are some of the ways, because we all do this. What are some of the ways that I have bought into a false narrative around what it means to be a biblically diverse community? So we start there. Self-introspection is key. And then it's having the conversation in appropriate circles. And I think for those of us, again, in the white majority culture, it's challenging ourselves and holding ourselves to that accountability versus putting the pressure and the expectation on our brothers and sisters of color, and in particular in the Black community right now, to educate us. That's not their responsibility. They've been doing that for years. They need to rest. They need space. They need to process. They need to grieve. They need to navigate their traumas right now. And it is our responsibility in the white community to educate ourselves and to begin that process of true, deep systemic change. And I think it has to start in the church. This is not going to start from a political agenda. It's not going to start from government. Like we've seen this historically, even back to biblical times with the Israelites. Like it is the church's responsibility to initiate this conversation and this change.
Yeah, and you think about what the power of what unity does look like in that. What a neat opportunity to step into a sense of purpose right now, even just for the church. Deb, just as a couple minutes here and just kind of bringing things home, but outside of your book, I think one of the things I've admired about you is that you've been a really big advocate for just talking about mental health, even in the Christian community. Why is that something that you're so passionate about? Why is that something that you feel like is so important?
Yeah, it goes back again to a lot of my own stories. So I mentioned my mom took her life about 12 years ago, and prior to that was battling, pretty significant mental illness. And we grew up in the church, and I just saw, I was old enough to kind of bear witness to her experience where she felt very ashamed and very isolated by what she was going through, and that if she reached out, it would shatter the identity of like this woman who had it all together, who was a leader in her community and in the church, instead of being able to come forward and to say, hey, I'm struggling, and have people come around her. And so for me, the more that I have seen, in my own life and with my clients and in churches that I've attended, that we have this conversation, the more we normalize the experience. And I think the more we open up the door for people who are really struggling to reach out and get help, or for those who aren't aware of, or who have just kind of historically maybe not seen because the conversation wasn't there, where those that they love are struggling. And so then they can say, I've got the resources to come alongside you and to support you in this process.
Deb, as we wrap up with one final question, with your book, and we talked about it, you are very, very vulnerable at certain times in your book. In the process of writing this book, how did it really help you personally and spiritually?
We'll talk about the ultimate accountability. You write a book called Embracing Uncomfortable, and everybody in your inner community is like, well, Deb, you did write a book about embracing uncomfortable, so you might want to step into this situation. Yeah, that was definitely a part of it. For me, one of my core values is authenticity. And again, things I've seen in my own life and in the circles of leadership that I've navigated is this false sense of, I have to be all together in order to be able to lead others. And yet we see in authors like Brene Brown, like the power of vulnerability and how people are really drawn to leaders that are willing to open up and share their own struggles. And I see that more than ever in the counseling community when I'm educating my students. We're human. We are sinful. We are going to navigate struggles in our own lives. And so if they don't feel like they have a leader they can come to and say, hey, this is something I'm struggling with that is likely going to impact my professional identity as a counselor, I can't help them grow there. I can't help them address that issue. So for me, it's always about turning the spotlight on myself. I always have places to grow. I'm always surrendering to God and working through humility in my own life. And I want to utilize that as an example for others. So hopefully in my experience, whether it's through navigating a parent who, committed suicide or being adopted or, going through some of the other things in my life, going to counseling, maybe my story will encourage somebody else to come forward and talk about their own experience and encounter transformation in that.
Perfect. Hey, Jillian, thank you very much for joining us, Jillian, and for hosting this with me. So I appreciate your friendship, Jillian.
You as well.
Me too.
And thank you as well. Thank you for just being so authentic. I think anybody who's listening in can feel that even through your own, how you're living out your purpose. And thank you for stepping into sharing these insights in this conversation with us. I think it challenges us to stop and pause and reflect and think differently about how we're living out our own purpose, even in this season.
Hey, and Deb, I actually did want to ask you more, if people want to find more information on the Gary Chapman Center, as well as your new podcast, where can they find it at?
Yeah. So if you're ever interested in counseling services that are low cost and affordable, MTS, Moody Theological Seminary, CC Counseling Center, .org. And you can find more about the book. I have a website, embracinguncomfortable.com, and we have an online community designed to support people who may feel stuck in this process. And so I would encourage them to check that out, and they can find more information there about me and the book and a whole host of other things.
Got it. Thank you so much, Deb. It's been a pleasure. And I really enjoyed reading your book. I know Jillian read your book last night, so thank you for sharing and coming on today.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, guys. Hey, have a good day, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Bye.
See you later. Thanks, partners.